Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined by not Dmitry Kalugin today, but rather a panel of known World War Now characters, people you have seen on this show before. That's right, I am joined by the estimable GSP from the War Report show, as well as Isaac Sweilem from the Never-Ending Catastrophe, which you can find on Substack. So we will have all of that linked down below so you can check out what they are doing outside of World War Now. But this is a big show, of course. Y'all probably realize how big we got news cucked with our previous episode. And of course, me and Dmitry, we were talking about the situation in Syria, which is what we're going to be talking about today. But of course, we know so much happened. And, next thing you know, by the time we'd even released the episode, Damascus had fallen. The whole situation had, ended up the way that it is. We're going to be breaking down the whole map there, the continual front as it continues to advance in all directions. We have Israel, we have the Kurds and the SDF, we have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Syrian National Army and the Turks, and a new Turkish invasion apparently happening. So we are going to be breaking all of that down and more. And of course, going down south into Lebanon, where our Zionist enemy is continuing its work. It is obviously advancing into Syria, as well as violating the ceasefire in Lebanon and continuing the genocide in Gaza, as well as setting its eyes on the West Bank, which we are going to be talking about all of that and so much more, as well as the front lines in Russia and the situation in Ukraine. We're going to be talking about how that even relates with the situation in Syria and Turkey, because all of this is very connected. And obviously, we're also going to be connecting it with the situation in the US. Trump is going to be coming in within a few weeks, almost less than a month away. So we're going to be talking about how all of that is going to tie together with the ongoing Third World War. So many prophecies tie into the situation with Syria, as well as, again, this unfolds. This is maybe the first conflict we've seen come to an end in the history of World War Now. I guess you could see the situation in Armenia and Azerbaijan as well, but this is something that we did not exactly see coming. We're going to be hitting it from all angles. And of course, talking about all the other World War III fronts that have unfolded in the midst of all of it. So thank you again, guys, so much for being here. GSP, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Very happy to be on the show. Thank you for the invite. Like you, I'm amazed at how fast these events have unfolded, and I'm eager to talk about it. As you say, it's very connected because of the amount of repercussions that are going to come out of Syria. But thank you for having me on the show.
No, thank you for being here. And Isaac, thank you for being here as well. We know that we like talking to you about the situation in the Middle East, so it felt appropriate.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for letting me have my input. And these are very interesting times, to put it lightly.
No, I think this will be a bit of, as Isaac was saying off air, we might do a little bit of black pilling. I know this isn't the black pilled show. We, of course, have faith in the resurrection, the bodily resurrection, the second coming of Christ. And even on this show, we know that what will become of the Third World War will, we believe, be ultimately positive in certain capacities. So with all that being said, however, it appears that the Assad regime has no more, how the Assad curse, so many memes have gone out the window. I don't know how the cultural referent that was Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime for foreign policy analysts online, for the culture of geopolitics, for the culture of right-wing analysis on these sorts of things. It's really a huge change. I mean, this has been a 10-plus year war at this point. I mean, 13 years in many ways. People have been covering all of this, if you want to, depending on how long you've been looking at it. I know for GSP, you guys on the War Report, this was kind of the main conflict that got it started that you were covering. So I guess with all of this big background, I'll ask you first, what happened exactly? What went wrong and why did this happen?
There's many factors. If you wanted to boil it down to why the regime fell, ultimately it comes down with American involvement and presence in Syria. As early as late 2013 and 2014 is when we heard of, they're always going to underestimate the numbers, but we heard about various American commandos and special forces within Syria. At this point, al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually became ISIL, ISIS, whatever you want to call it, had moved into Syria. And that's when efforts by the Americans went into effect to not necessarily prop them up, but prop them up if they were in conflict with Assad. And there were also some interesting choices that Assad made in 2018. So we started recording, if I'm not mistaken, we started recording back around 2018. I want to say early 2018. Now, at the time, I was just a returning guest, and the show was done by Constantine and another fellow. I don't see him in any circles anymore that I used to. He was actually Persian background, and I'm not going to use like the title that or his real name, obviously. But so in those early years, I was a returning guest, and eventually he didn't want to do the show anymore. It had to do with his career, and so that was that. But there were some things that puzzled me about the decisions that Assad made. For instance, the Russians offered to re-equip his troops and to create new military academies to train the troops and so on. Mind you, the Russians were never going to have like enormous amounts of troops within Syria. The help was primarily air support and intelligence and a little bit of air defense. Wagner was brought in, but it's a limited role that they played. But the decision that Assad made was he did not want to refit and find new support through cooperation with the Russians. And then in 2000, like near the end of 2018, he began getting rid of his officers. And the officers that replaced them were Alawites that were even from the village and region that he was from. Some of them were, if I'm not mistaken, also relatives. He also wanted to change the structure from a conscript army to a professional army. And that really wasn't in the cards as well. So there were these kinds of decisions on his part that also weakened his forces and led to, it wasn't a corruption like the kind of corruption that you see in Ukraine, for instance, like the corruption when there is too much money coming in, but rather when there isn't enough money. So an example would be the Syrian army would take over a place, and let's say you're in the south in Daraa, and the locals who back in 2018, 2019 were stirring up trouble, and the Russians played a mediating role. These people were basically paid off, right? But in other areas where the Syrians took over, the soldiers basically had created checkpoints so that whoever was passing through would donate. Well, essentially, it was a kind of a small donation, a tax, and that was to get funding that was sorely lacking. Again, in retrospect, we'll look back and think, how did Syria still survive after 13 years of conflict? That is, I think, what we're going to what we're going to think about. And no matter how bad the outcome was, Syria will be Libya or Iraq. It will be a destroyed place in constant conflict. You already have of course, we know about the violent Sunni extremists fighting against the SDF, but then there's the Syrian National Army that's also in conflict with HDS. Both of them are violent Sunni groups propped up by Gulf states in the West and in Israel. So I would say that, like, take, for instance, Iraq and Libya, right? People will remember the time before the utter devastation of those countries, rather than this bleak period, this dark age that's there for both of them. And now it may be elusive, but I think the West will want to forget Syria. It will want the public to forget Syria in the same way that Iraq was largely forgotten. Afghanistan even was largely forgotten until the pullout, and Libya is completely forgotten. So that's what we're going to be looking forward to, looking toward, but not forward to. So I think, now we hear stories, for instance, that the average officer in the Syrian army was getting paid about $40 a month. The Salafist insurgents and those Takbiris or whatever you want to call them, the names always change depending on what kind of use there are for Western media, but their soldiers were paid 10 times what a general was paid. So I would say, if you want a quick synopsis of how and why everything melted away, first of all, the speed actually surprised even the adversaries of Assad. The initial forces that were sent towards Aleppo were not that huge a number. And contrary to what people think, the Russians did bomb them. In fact, some of the earliest videos I saw of casualties were all from HTS, one of the violent Sunni extremist groups. And then even when they took Aleppo, there were bombings. Now, the other important thing to keep in mind is, and I've watched a video about this, and I think it's worth looking into. So there's a channel called NCF Peace. It's a little channel, 2,000 followers. I think this gentleman might be Syrian. He speaks with a British accent, so he's probably been in Britain for a long time. He was in communication with the general in the 4th Division of the Syrian army, and a Christian general at that. And what he says basically confirms what the YouTube channel History Legend said in his video, a 47-minute video that came out just 4 or 5 days before the fall of Damascus and essentially the end of the war. And that is, they went against the insurgent army. I mean, this is known now. The insurgent army was the most in Syria, was the most well-funded army of American history. But in this attack towards Aleppo, they used drones. They used drones that had very high quality recording, real time. So that means they're using something like, what is it? The Elon Musk, is it Starlink?
Or like Starlink or something? Yeah.
Yes. So they would be using something like that. Now, people talked about the effectiveness of their drone strikes. That is true. And I even saw drone strikes by the Syrian army against the HTS onslaught. But one of the things I was thinking would happen was when the fighting would come to Aleppo, that would slow things down, right? Drone warfare is not as effective in a very densely populated center like Aleppo. Even the roads are very small. It's very narrow. It's not easy to fight with. Drones are very useful in wide open areas where really, if there's no safe place for soldiers to hide in a trench, they're cooked, right? They will be picked off very easily. But when it came to fighting in Aleppo, that dissolved very quickly. In fact, at one point, the Russian Air Force literally went in, the Russian forces that were in Aleppo went in and actually rescued about 600 officers. Again, this is referring to the channel of NCF Peace and his communication on WhatsApp with this Syrian general. Despite that bombing, the Russians still did continue to bomb. Now, because of the war in Ukraine, this reduced the size of the Air Force in Syria, the Russian Air Force, which was never that big to begin with. But this general presumes about 10 helicopters and between 5 to 6 operational jets. These are not the heavy duty bombers. These would be like Su-34s, Su-35s. Maybe they're dropping like Fab 250s, Fab 500s. They're not dropping like necessarily bunker busters, but they wouldn't need it because the kind of forces that the HTS used were very rapid, well equipped, mostly infantry fighting vehicles, not too many tanks. And so Aleppo fell very quickly. And I think it was at this point when Aleppo fell very quickly that I think Iranians and Russians began to worry. Of course, we know now that 2 months prior to the invasion, which started roughly December 1st, that the Iranians and the Russians had warned Assad that something was brewing. And then 2 weeks before the HTS incursion, we have reports from the Iranians saying Assad was warned. I think in the end, we're going to probably come to the conclusion, I think, that Syria was never going to be able to outlast the sanctions. You could also, I think, to a degree, blame the Chinese. I mean, there's lots of blame to go around. There were a lot of factors. Again, why did Assad refuse to refit, retool his army, and then get rid of the officers who had the most amount of experience, who were fighting in this war since 2011? You saw, and I don't want to overdraw the comparison, but you saw this with Pashinyan when the Armenians successfully fought against the Azerbaijanis, and then Pashinyan gets elected, and then he gets rid of them. There's something odd about that. I'm not saying the reasons were the same as Pashinyan, but one thing that might be able to explain it is Assad desperately wanted to also be included in the Arab League, and he was given more and more indications that that was going to, and of course he was. Eventually, Syria was recognized. There's also, I think, there's a sense in the Middle East that you don't want these European powers there, whether they're American or whether they're Russian. They're from a different civilization. They're not really wanted. Maybe that played a role for Assad. Maybe, his application to join BRICS, the promises from the West that some of the sanctions would be lifted, this feeling that maybe there was a breakthrough and he wouldn't have to change things. I mean, it looks like all of these were lies, or certainly Turkey played a role in backstabbing Assad and Putin and Iran. So the fighting continued towards Hama. The Russians took out the largest bridge in Syria in order to stop them from going towards Homs. It deteriorated extremely quickly. And the worst days for Syria have only started, particularly for Alawites and Christians. I mean, that's kind of, for me, like a very, very brief synopsis.
That's good. I think that analysis from that small channel, that's some good stuff that I think a lot of people are going to find. I mean, that's the kind of deeper on the ground analysis that comports with, the kind of confusion that we get at the meta level. It helps us understand why it's so confusing. Because at the end of the day, it seems that a lot of the factions weren't communicating at the levels that I think a lot of people might have even thought they were at this point, considering how well then and quickly this fell apart. I mean, we were getting reports that, Assad has family members and cousins that weren't able to get out in time, that got killed. And again, I don't know how much of this is narrative warfare. I don't know how much, like you said, off-air GSP, how much of this are people trying to say that, Iran and Russia abandoned Assad and they wanted this to happen. And at the same time, though, we can't ignore the fact that there was a motivation from every factor that supports Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine conflict to distract Russia from keeping Assad protected in Syria. So we can't ignore that at a certain level, these countries, Russia, Iran, these aren't America or China in how they're able to operate. So they have to operate within their spheres of influence in some capacity. But right now, really quick, just to make sure everybody understands the state of the map. Again, we're still talking about what happened, a week ago, but right now, Syria is still being invaded. Israel is in the Kunatra region. They have advanced well past the Golan Heights, deep into Syria. They are taking Druze villages. Netanyahu is meeting with Druze leaders, and there's already overt conversations about a Druze state being carved out in southern Syria, and all of the Druze leaders say they want that to be part of Israel. So we are directly getting new maps from all sorts of sources speculating on what new Greater Israel is going to look like. Greater Israel continuing to expand. They're getting South Lebanon. They're getting the Golan. They're getting the West Bank. Now they're getting all sorts of parts of Syria. This is, again, if you're listening to the show, this doesn't surprise you, but, at one moment you're an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. On the next moment, it just happens and the map has been changed. So I think that's why people need to. And I think it's all the other factor, just to make sure that everybody understands who all is involved here. The Turks have the Turkish military itself is now just entered Syria, and they are waging war against the PKK and the YPG, which are, of course, Kurdish militias and groups that are supported by the American-backed Syrian Defense Forces, the SDF, who control all of the northeastern portion of Syria, Deir ez-Zor region and all of that, which is where most of the oil in Syria is. This is a lot of where the fighting against ISIS had been taking place. So again, if you're picturing the map, imagine, all of the HTS, the Sunni militias, the SNA, which again are very Turkish-backed, they control the majority of what you consider central Syria, obviously Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and now Damascus. And now in the very south, in the Golan, and even in the Druze regions, we have Israel operating. And then in the northwest, we still have the Kurds and the SDF. But the Turks are in that region right now, fighting against the Kurds, fighting against these American-backed forces. And we don't know, are the Turks going to annex some of this territory? Are they going to just go in there and make sure that any kind of independent Kurdistan would have no political party to operate within it if that were to happen? All of these questions, are coming to rise, especially as the Iraqis take note of this and mobilize onto their border. Lebanese forces have mobilized to the Syrian border. And I'm sure Hezbollah is wondering what the heck to do at this point. So Isaac, I want to go to you at this point. You have a lot of understanding of sort of the factionalism within the Muslim world. What is going to happen right now within all of these parties in Syria? Because we see HTS Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, al-Jalani, their leader, he refused to meet with any SDF members in Damascus. And now that we see this Turkish incursion into SDF territory, it seems that HTS and even SNA, HTS and SNA obviously are perhaps looking to see the SDF and the Kurds completely disenfranchised and defeated, as it were, so that they can completely, not have to deal with them in the negotiations for ruling all of Syria as they see fit now. So I'm wondering, what do you think is going to happen? Of course, Israel invading as well. All of these factions, how are they going to come together or not? What's going to happen here in the next few weeks?
In the next few weeks, we're going to see Israel consistently bombing Syria to get rid of whatever military infrastructure they still haven't destroyed. We are going to see Turkey probably securing the gains they've made in northern Syria. We're going to see the SDF and HTS starting to fight each other. And what we might start seeing is not only the Druze of southern Syria making the decision to be assimilated into Israel, become Israeli citizens, or to have their area be annexed properly, or at least once openly saying they want this. We might even see the Alawites on the coast of Latakia and Tartus declare an independent state. Syria will be broken up. This will be Libya 2.0. I'd like to remind everyone that 13 years after Gaddafi was removed, Libya is still in crisis. There is no unified government. There are two parliaments that claim to be representing Libya that fight each other while they're fighting multiple Islamist groups and Tuareg militias that basically
And it's another Russian-Turkish proxy war there too.
Yes, it is. And what we're seeing is the destruction of Syria, in my opinion, is the destruction of the Arab world in many ways. Because the thing about HTS is that HTS, their allies particularly, this is not the end goal specifically for the allies. I'm speaking specifically for groups like the Turkestan Islamic Party. There's about 5,000 members of this militia in Syria right now. The vast majority of whom are Uyghurs, with some Tajiks and Uzbeks. And these are not people who are willing to settle and stop in Syria. The Islamic Revolution, the jihad that they want, they're going to export it to other parts of the Middle East. I think their next stop is Jordan, not Lebanon, because I think part of the reason why the Israelis have invaded Syria is to prepare for an invasion of Lebanon. Because the invasion they're engaging in is literally right on the border with Lebanon. I don't think they're going to invade Damascus. There's some people who, even though they're 15 miles away from Damascus, I don't see any reason for them to do so unless another crisis happens and they see an opportunity. I think what they're doing is they want to carve out parts of Syria for themselves if possible, besides annexing the entirety of the Golan Heights and taking Mount Hermon, or frankly speaking, its real name is Jabal al-Sheikh. But I think they want to invade Lebanon from the north, which makes it easier for them to attack Hezbollah. And I think it's possible that they want to replay 1982, inspired by Sharon, where Ariel Sharon, the defense minister, invaded Lebanon, convinced Menachem Begin, the prime minister, to invade Lebanon in 1982 to create a Maronite state in Lebanon that would expel the Palestinians into Jordan. The hopes that would overthrow the monarchy and create a Palestinian state, which would create an excuse for him to expel all the Palestinians from Palestine into Jordan. Well, I think it's something similar, but what he wants to do is he just wants to pummel Hezbollah, create a Maronite state, or at least create the kind, possibly even just simply ignite another civil war to keep Lebanon destabilized, and maybe create a Maronite state somewhere in the northern or central part of Lebanon. Like they had that Lebanese Free State that only controlled like a suburb of Lebanon in 1982. I think that a lot of these guys for a lot of them, Syria is not going to be enough. At some point, they're going to export this to Jordan. They're going to want to overthrow the monarchy. They will want to create a Salafist state there. I don't know how successful they are, but the problem is if they're successful, and let's just say they create an Islamic state that is going to be run by majority Palestinians, because Jordan is majority Palestinian, 60%. The Israelis will seize upon that opportunity by possibly creating a quote-unquote buffer zone in Jordan, and by saying, okay, the Palestinians now have their own state. They are no longer ruled by this descendant of the prophet from the Hejaz. Now it's time for them to go. I think that Syria as a whole will never be unified, at least not for a very long time. The north will be controlled by the Turks, as the Turks push their neo-Ottoman influence into Aleppo and Idlib. The south, specifically the Druze parts near the Golan Heights, will be controlled and influenced by the Israelis. Damascus will be influenced by the Gulf states, and northeastern Syria will be the United States and the Kurds, but mostly the United States. So long as the United States still has a presence in northeastern Turkey and the Kurds have a presence there, then Syria will still be economically in a very dire shape, because I'm not wholly sure the Kurds are willing to share the oil and the gas and the wheat. The wheat, that's very important. There's a lot of wheat being farmed in that area. They're not willing to share that. And I think Syria will very much still be in very, very dire straits. And I'll tell you this is my big prediction. With everything that we've seen from this new government in terms of its relationship with Israel, because not only has it not said anything about the Israeli attacks on the Syrian military infrastructure and the Israeli annexation of Syrian territory, not only have they refused to say anything about it, as of today, they've told the Palestinian militant groups that Bashar al-Assad was supplying and training and keeping active that they need to lay down their arms and disband their camps. And my prediction is within 3 to 5 years, I promise you, there's going to be an Israeli flag in Damascus as the Israelis build their embassy there. This new government, whatever's left of it, will normalize with Israel. These Salafists are uninterested in helping the Palestinians. They are uninterested in liberating Palestine. They just want to create their own Islamic state in Syria and basically rule over the ashes of what they destroyed. And to be quite frank, I am very ashamed to be an Arab. I am very humiliated to be an Arab. The century of humiliation only seems to continue. We Arabs, we talk such a big talk about how we know the plans of Israel, the greater Israel they want to create, how they want to dominate and divide and conquer us. And yet especially the so-called Ummah puts its full force into supporting the militant groups backed by the puppet masters they claim to hate. They see everything. You'll see them on Twitter and on Facebook posting the quotes and posting the evidence about greater Israel and this, that, and the other thing, and posting their outrage. And then when the time comes to act, they will simply and they have today, handed the keys to greater Israel to the Israelis. They have sacrificed their stability, destroyed their stability, and called it resistance. It is very much like burning down your house and then raging at all the smoke. And so much of this has to do with this greater sense of the quote-unquote Ummah. And Ummah is Arabic for the faith community, the Sunni faith community, that say what you want about Bashar al-Assad. Yes, he was a brutal dictator. This was not some saint. This was an authoritarian that ruled Syria with an iron fist. But ultimately, the reason why they hated him was because he was an Alawite. They have said nothing about the UAE that is ruled by an iron fist, and the fact that the vast majority of its population are literally slaves, are practically slaves. They've said nothing about Saudi Arabia, which engages in the same kind of behavior. They've said nothing about Qatar and Bahrain and Kuwait, and they have not overthrown the Jordanians, who all these countries, or the Egyptians, all these countries are ruled with iron fists. They have all refused to do anything to help the Palestinians, and many of them have actually arrested and cracked down on pro-Palestine activism and protesters in their own countries. They've done nothing and they've said nothing. What they have done is prepare for 15 months to destroy the one nation that was still fighting for its sovereignty. I mean, let's be honest, Syria really hasn't been sovereign since 2012 with, since the war started, but it was at least fighting for its sovereignty. And they destroyed that. The one Arab sovereign nation is gone. Syria will be carved up like a cake. The Hezbollah will be weakened because Syria was the pipeline and the road upon which weapons were sent to Hezbollah. Syria also helped provide supplies, armaments, and certain other things to the resistance in Palestine. That's all gone now. Hezbollah will be localized. It will no longer be a regional player, even though they still have a formidable armament. Eventually, that's just going to run out because they're not being supplied on the regular. In fact, I've gotten reports, I can't confirm them, that PIJ and Hamas are considering striking a deal with Israel. At this point, I'm not even sure I blame them, because with the end of Syria, I mean, the technological...
Well, Isaac, we could talk about this in a second, but I just got to get your thoughts. Like, we know Hamas, of course, is Sunni. We know that they even have more direct ties with Turkey and groups that would be tied with them. I'm wondering, how does this, like every other part of the resistance, literally every single other part is Shia in some capacity. We have the Houthis, we have Hezbollah, we have Iran, we had Syria, we had everything going on there. Was there a breakdown in actual unity among, the Palestinian resistance against Israel here? I'm wondering what's happening there, because at the same time, I mean, right now, obviously, you mentioned the Kurds. I don't trust the Kurds as far as I can throw them, but I'm wondering but we're going to talk about West Bank and Gaza in a second, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts on all of that were, because it seems that, obviously, like you said, if there's a deal about to come between the Sunni Gaza factions, that might have to do with the breakdown of the resistance elsewhere.
The Sunni Gaza factions always had a very strange relationship with the al-Assad family, because there were times when the al-Assad family was supportive of them. There were times when they weren't. The al-Assad family had always supported the more secular groups over Hamas, like the PFLP, the DFLP. And initially, Hamas fought against this al-Assad during the civil war, but by 2012, they had decided to be neutral, and I think in some cases fight alongside Assad, at the very least, no longer fight against them. I think in many ways what's happened is that, at least for Hamas, they've realized that it's over for the al-Assad regime. So they have accepted this. They said, okay, we recognize this new government as the legitimate government of Israel. Sorry, excuse me. Freudian slip there, as the new government of Syria, hoping that maybe they can build relationships with it in some form or another. I think by the end of the day, it's like I said, with the breakup of Syria and the destruction of Syria, what we've seen is the end of Arab sovereignty. And what makes it more shameful and humiliating is the fact that now all the Arabs are now looking for new leaders. They're looking for new masters. The Sunnis have somehow, and this is what's very frustrating, somehow a lot of Sunnis have decided that the Turks are their heroes.
I was going to say, is this not Sultan Erdogan future? Is that not what we're seeing?
That's what's happening, and that's what's frustrating, is that even though Erdogan supplies 40% of Israel's gas and oil through Azerbaijan, even though Erdogan trades in weapons and in cement with Israel, the Sunnis have decided, the Sunni world, and like Syrians, and even the Palestinians to some degree. I've seen Palestinians tweet in support of Erdogan, especially after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, have decided the Sunnis want to see, they want the Turks to be their masters again. The Alawites, possibly they want the French to be their masters. The Druze want Israel to be their masters. The Christians will sit here and talk about how they want to create an independent state, but who will fund them? Eventually, they're going to end up being forced to be the vassals of Israel, because the Israelis will see the Christians, whether Orthodox or Maronite or Catholic or what have you, they will pit them against all the other different groups, whether Shia or Sunni. And it's disgusting because, especially the Palestinians, I've seen Palestinians who are openly saying, I have Palestinian friends who openly say that if compared to Iran, they would rather be underneath the Turks. And I'm like, in the name of God, man, where is your pride? Like, where is the pride of such men such as Zahar al-Omar in the 18th century who broke free from the Turks and created his own kingdom that was a good place to live for everyone? Whereas the pride of the peasants of in Gaza of the 1840s who rebelled against the Turks? Whereas the same pride that led Faisal bin Ali bin Hashim to revolt against the Turks in 1915? Is this what we are? Servile? Is this what we are? Dhimmis? Dhimmis to whoever will be nice to us? Have we no sense of pride as men? Have we no sense of pride as Arabs? Arabs of the Levant? It's frankly, it's shameful. It's shameful. It's humiliating. It's humiliating beyond all degree.
It's just which arm of Zog do you want to get under? Do you want to get under the Turkish arm of Zog, the U.S. arm of Zog, or just the Jews themselves? Like, those are literally the only three options.
If I could bring up a little story.
Well, I just want to say, before you say that, excuse me, I apologize. And I just want to say that I will say this: by the end of the day, the axis of resistance is at least for now broken. And I think by the end of the day, while I cannot blame the Russians much, because the Russians were tied up in Ukraine and other projects. The Iranians had no excuse for not interfering or not intervening, or frankly not pressuring the Assad regime much more than they frankly should have. The Iranians want to say that they are the leaders of the Axis of Resistance. They want to say that they're leading an actual fight against Zog and against the West. But what have they really done ultimately? Performative strikes against Israel. And that's what these are. Performative strikes against Israel. They have not really defended Hezbollah or the Lebanese against Israeli bombardment, nor have they. I mean, they could have. They could have attacked Israel while Israel was attacking Hezbollah, attacking the air bases that they know they can strike, and they've struck before, but they won't. But they won't do anything. They won't actually cripple Israel's almighty advantage, their air force, or at least hinder it. They talk. They talk a big game. Yeah, they'll give arms and they ship arms, but ultimately, strategic patience has become strategic cowardice. They blundered their way through this. I think when Raisi and the foreign minister were killed, and I say killed, not died, in that chopper crash in the hills of mountains of Azerbaijan, that was the beginning of the end. And I think the death of Hassan Nasrallah was when it was obvious that it was over. And everyone was still coping, but now we can't cope anymore. With the destruction of Syria, we can't cope anymore. I don't care what Professor Mohammed Marandi says, God bless his soul. I don't care what a lot of these guys on YouTube or Twitter are saying. Everyone's coping real hard. That's what it is. It's cope. It's over for now. It's frankly over. Pezeshkian has proven himself to be frankly unwilling to actually engage, and Iran has lost its credibility, and rightfully so.
That's where I wanted to go with that. I want to go with you, GSP. I want to hear your thoughts. I mean, I've become convinced at this point that the faction in Iran is literally just trying to completely renege and reproach with the West, and is willing to abandon everything.
Yeah, well, let's put some historical context here. And I'll begin, just before I do, one more little aside. In the weeks prior to the HTS invasion, Assad moved 5 brigades, including the Tiger, brigades to the south, right? This is another I can't explain why he did this. And he complied with Israel to remove some of the Hezbollah fighters on the west side of Aleppo. Again, more strangeness. But here's what I'll say about Iran. And I'll give you a little story, because I think it's going to be easy now to try to blame Iran about this, or Hezbollah. There is blame, but let me get into it. So I was talking to this guy that I work with. He's Sunni Pakistani background. His parents are not particularly religious at all. Big fans of country music and Elvis. Quite secular, to be totally honest, although he does fast and celebrates the religious holidays. He is far from religious. But we got into a geopolitical talk, and I said, from a Western point of view, of a person who is on top of geopolitical developments, the Sunnis are jokers. They're jokers compared to the Shia. Why do I say this? Well, I mean, all the big movers and shakers in the Sunni world have American bases, right? It's when you have an American base, it's over. It's de facto over, right? The Shia were actually capable of getting rid of the British and the Americans. Like, they actually did that, right? You guys didn't. What was the whole point of Osama bin Laden? He was literally just trying to get the Sunni world to catch up to where the Shia already were, right? And he tried all these different methods, right? Whatever you believe about 9/11. I mean, I don't buy the official story either, obviously. I'd have to be an idiot. But if you just focus on the attacks on the American embassies in Africa in the 90s, prior to 9/11, what's he trying to do? He's trying to rouse up. I mean, first of all, they're running these stupid errand games for the U.S. and Afghanistan because of the Khorasan prophecy that from this Khorasan region, and which includes part of eastern Iran, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and they're gonna go all the way across through Iran, and they're gonna invade Israel from the north, and et cetera, et cetera. They fixate on this like they couldn't grab planes from Qatar and just drive across Saudi Arabia. It's like, no, my man, the reason you can't do this is because the Americans and all these other places of the Sunni world are occupied, and you've been occupied for friggin' decades. Like, wake up. Like, also, to be fair to the Shia, yeah, I mean, Hamas does this spectacular attack on October 7th, 2023. You never saw any Sunnis sacrificing themselves. Like, you saw how they're willing to rush towards Aleppo, and you see like columns of their armored vehicles destroyed and like bodies strewn around. Like, they're willing to die. They're willing to die in big numbers, but just not for the Palestinians, right?
Yeah, not for other Sunnis, apparently, that like the whole world has been caring about.
Right. Like, I mean, at least the Iranians did manage to send in a few brigades, but it was obvious, like, there was no fight left in the Syrian army. That's what was obvious with Aleppo. This is a city that's at least 2.5 million people. I mean, it's bigger than Kharkov. It's the size of Kiev, right? It's incredibly dense, right? This is not like, if you could turn that into a fortress. I mean, the radical Sunnis turned it into a fortress for 4.5 years. It could have stabilized the front, right? But the fight was gone. 800 casualties for the whole thing.
Yeah, they drove through it with motorcycles. They were like, by the time I was done recording the show, I was like, oh, they're taking 50% of the city. 2 hours later, they take the whole dang thing. I was like, well, that show is worthless. I mean, thanks everyone for liking the episode, but it was like, what the hell?
So I think one of the things that, like, I've become fascinated with is the way, like, you could say that American intelligence has worked with various Sunni prophecies about Khorasan. How do you pronounce it, Isaac? You would know.
I think it's just Khorasan or something. I mean, I've had to actually look at it physically.
Yeah, so Khorasan, that whole prophecy, the Taliban represents this idea that one of the lost 10 tribes of Israel is there, and so on and so forth. And so the Sunnis are in this competition with the Shia, and like they're really not even taking care of their own. And the part of this would be linked to, like, the humiliating defeats in the 50s and 60s and 70s against Israel. Anyone who knows me, who's familiar in these circles, knows I'm an anti-Zionist. I don't even believe in the right for Israel to exist. So, like, obviously. But I have to mention that. And part of it is a jealousy. And that's the other thing I told this guy. I said, you cannot stand to look at Iran on some level because it's an embarrassment, right? And you find this in the war in Ukraine with various Europeans and Eastern Europeans. Like today, for instance, in Warsaw, the LGBTQ museum opened up. And remember 2 weeks ago when Russia raided all those gay clubs? Well, Poland passed a law saying that it's an offense to insult an LGBTQ person, and this is the fine you'll pay if you do it. And if you do it again, you're going to get a bigger fine, and so on and so on. Like, so what with these Eastern European powers, it's like they made their decision decades ago to have these American bases, but if we can just defeat Russia, then we'll kick the Americans out. No, you're not going to do that. You're a pawn. worry about your master in your own country rather than going to war with Russia, right? But part of it is just an embarrassment. It's to erase the source of the embarrassment. And I think that's what Iran represents to the Sunni world. More than, Iran, to be honest, never had the power to go toe-to-toe with Israel. They never did. There was no Air Force. There was no, the strikes are basically just to warn the Israelis. But they know they could never do it. In many ways, it was Hamas who dragged them into this because nobody in the Sunni world supported them except the Shia. Nobody was willing to do that fight. It's their own cowardice, it's their own laziness. Like I said, it's not like people talk about the Arab street, blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, a lot of them now are ecstatic that Bashar al-Assad is gone. Oh, the prisons are all, they've been freed. You're supposed to believe the prisons by HTS are better than those by Assad. This is just stupid. It's just stupid. These are just
we're seeing We're seeing CNN propaganda where it's like,
yes,
he's seeing light for the first time in 3 months. What am I watching?
Fake.
Do they think we're back in 2002 again? How retarded do they think people
are? This is nonsense. Like Sednaya prison was visibly a brutal place where former ISIS murderers, rapists, and yes, even political prisoners were kept. But 150,000 people were not there. It was about 4,000 people. And there was no panini press used to squish prisoners to death. We're
getting the Holocaust roller coaster masturbation machine version.
That's unironically what this is. And I think just what's frustrating, GSP, to get a little bit into this is just the thing with the Arabs specifically is that the Arabs in the peninsula have accepted themselves as servile.
Yeah, they have.
After the oil embargo in 1973, Kissinger came to the King of Saudi Arabia and basically made him a deal he felt that he couldn't refuse, and I guess he realized that could fight
the American dollar, right? Because America basically bankrupted themselves in Vietnam, and this was the way to prop it up. But it was also a way to attack the British silver sterling.
And the Saudi king realized, oh wow, Saudi Arabia will be rich forever. And he decided ultimately that was worth Arab pride, and that was worth Arab sovereignty and dignity. Sovereignty and dignity, not even just pride. And so the Arabs of the peninsula, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, the Qataris, the Bahrainis, and the Kuwaitis have decided 50 years ago to sell themselves and to be servile vassals to the Americans. Mm-hmm. The Arabs of the Levant they're willing to do the same thing, but they don't even see it as that way. They seem to think that by being servile to whether it's Turks or the Israelis or the Americans or whoever, even if the Shia decide that they want to be under Iran, by the end of the day, everyone is shameful and disgusting. I've said this 100 times. I'm going to say it again, whether it's on this podcast or on my Twitter feed or on Instagram, or if people ask me about it, I'm just going to say it's incredibly shameful and disgusting. We've allowed ourselves to to be bickering fools. And the Ummah the quote unquote Ummah has allowed itself to play a role in this. First off, in several ways. First off, Levantine Arabs have allowed Salafist imams from the Gulf and Pakistan and Central Asia and Cairo to dictate Islam to them and to tell them what kind of Islam they should be. They've allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to poison the Islam of the Levant, which itself is quite beautiful. In fact, the Salafism that was born out of Cairo and Damascus 140, 150 years ago is nothing like the Salafism today. It was a quietist, pietist movement. It was what it is now, what it's grown to be since the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting to see what it is, this Arab Judaism. That's just what it is. It's Arab Talmudic Judaism. These people, they are the mirror equivalent of Hasidic Jews in terms of their practice, in terms of their legalism, treating God like a court jester, like a court judge, and frankly, just in terms, they have the same kind of violent instinct almost as the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox Jews. I mean, tell me ultimately what's the difference between these Uyghur and Central Asian fighters in Syria that are throwing Alawites or Christians out of their homes so they can take them over because they're saying, oh, well, Muslims have a right to live in Muslim lands. What's the difference between that and an Orthodox Jew in the West Bank that terrorizes a Palestinian farmer and takes his land, takes his house? There's no difference. The Sunni Muslim world, and a lot of it, I apologize, but a lot of it has to do, I think, with the fact that Arabs in America specifically, I can't comment for Europe or for Canada, the Arabs in America do not really have institutions that represent them as Arabs. I mean, the Antiochian church does that. Arab Christians are very culturally organized, but Arab Muslims are not. Arab Muslims are organized by their faith, by the Ummah. They're organized around the masjid. And the thing is that you do not have masjids that are meant specifically for Arabs or a particular kind of Arabs, whether they're from the Gulf or from the Levant or from North Africa. The masjid is the masjid, and the masjid is for everyone, which, okay, sure is cool. But if that's the only institution that Arabs from the Levant can go to meet other Arabs, the problem is that the Arab identity becomes subsumed under an Islamic identity, and that's how they identify. So when they see the struggles in the Middle East, they see it as an Islamic struggle, a Sunni struggle. When they see the suffering in Palestine, they see it as Islamic struggle, as a Sunni struggle. And one thing I'd like to point out to a lot of people is that, historically speaking, this stuff just never works. It fails, A. And B, this is exactly what Israel wants. This kind of Salafism, this kind of like extreme radicalism. This is how first off, literally, HTS funded, it's called supplied by Turkey, funded by Qatar, right? And even before that, ISIS and al-Nusra Front. These people beforehand were funded by the Gulf and funded by the Americans through Operation Timber Sycamore for years. Al-Julani has been given a royal makeover and treatment by the American press. And people don't see
Well, he still had
this.
a 10 million bounty on his head. I find that very ironic.
That'll go away soon enough. That'll go away soon enough.
It will, but I just thought that was funny.
It is still pretty funny that you can find the reward for him on Twitter by the American, I guess, State Department or like the CIA or what have you. I've seen those tweets by American government accounts on Twitter.
We got to keep the train chugging along here. I want to ask, the situation specifically in Latakia is obviously developing and it's becoming pretty interesting. Isaac, you mentioned the possibility of an independent Alawite state. Some people think that they needed to have done something in the immediate aftermath of the fall of Damascus to help secure that better. Obviously, Assad himself is in Russia. I know other Alawites have been fleeing, but GSP, I want to get your perspective on what is the Russian remnant going to be in Syria? What is going on with the ports in Latakia and Tartus? I want to know if there was a chance that Turkey was perhaps threatening the closure of the straits to those ships if Russia intervened more on the kind of behind the scenes baseball, and I'm just overall wondering what do you think Assad, what did him and the Russians agree to? What is the sort of general outlook? We all saw that video of those Russian forces really unloading on the Syrian forces for surrendering. Obviously, we gave a bit of background on why that was pretty obvious to happen, but what do you think is going to happen with the port there? Because the reason, I mean, Strelkov talked about this years ago in 2018 about how Syria is going to be this big issue for Russia and how the Turks are going to be able to really expand their influence and we aren't prepared for it. And it seems like that's exactly what happened. I didn't think that they would abandon those ports and the importance that they have in their navy so quickly. So I'm wondering what's going to happen there.
Right. So I think there's two things that you can say about this region. So let me just back up a little bit before I continue. As I said yesterday, we recorded with George McMillan, and he has a very interesting take, which lines up with what I was saying about Kherson and the prophecy and so on. Now, part of the troubles in Syria emanate from Assad's decision not to allow the Qatari gas pipeline. Because, a few decades ago, there was an enormous amount of gas reserves that were discovered in the Persian Gulf. About 40% on the Iranian side, 60% on the Qatari side. And the Qataris wanted to build a pipeline that went through Saudi Arabia, then jutted straight north through Jordan into Syria, and then offloaded either somewhere in the Mediterranean or in Turkey. But that was the general idea. He said no. And then that's about when things started to fly off, right? So, like, the only way for the Russians to have these bases is if they strike a deal with HTS. Now, George thought that there's a definite possibility that that's going to happen. And he does mention that, he's prognosticating here. He's going to go out on a limb and he's going to say that that is what's going to happen. The other thing that he mentions is that now China, Iran, and Russia could begin funding HTS as a bulwark against Israel. Now, you have to assume that somewhere along the way, HTS and these other various groups will not fight each other and will decide to fight Israel. That would be the subtext to all these prognostications, right? So I'm not so sure about that. Now, I saw reports today that the Russians are thinking of packing up and leaving. The one thing I asked on the show that we recorded last night was, okay, who are Russia's allies in the Mediterranean? The whole of it. None.
None.
None. There isn't any. Right? There just isn't any.
Metropolitan Neophytos.
Yeah. I mean, look, yeah. I mean, I admire that they went in and did so well for the time that they could, but there isn't. There are no states that support Russia, and after the beginning of the SMO, there are even fewer states. So, what is Russia's role in the Eastern Mediterranean if it has no allies? What is it doing there? What's its purpose? Right? What's this projection all about? And I think that's what is eventually going to decide whether there is a region of Latakia that is separate, if it ever even happens. Now, it's an area that is quite well defended. During those 7-8 days of fighting that saw the fall of Syria, there were Turkmen that went from the north and tried to attack the Latakia base. Now, the Russians wiped them out. And even preceding the HTS attack, the Russians had already begun stepping up bombing raids on Idlib. I remember seeing that. Now, on the show that Constantine and I do, we haven't been doing many Syrian updates because it's been, for the last 4 years, it's been more or less the same thing. It's just attacks in the middle of the desert, bombing Idlib, like without anything significant happening. So why is Russia there? Who are its allies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Those questions will have to be answered. Like, why are you there? Why do you want to be there? When there is like literally no state that supports you. And even like, even some of the people that like ultimately you helped have claimed you didn't do enough when no one else would. So what's the reward?
Well,
I
you've
don't
teed
see
me
it.
up, GSP.
Hmm?
You've teed me up for you've asked the political question that answers what, in theory, if the prophecies that we know from St. Paisios, and specifically in what I'm talking about right now is the prophecies from St. Philomenos and St. Gabriel of Georgia, that's asking that question. It's like, why would this have to happen? And of course, my answer to the political reality of why does Russia in theory need to stay in the Eastern Mediterranean? Why does it need to have some kind of port there? It's because, I mean, in theory, obviously, it was to bolster the Assad regime and prevent what we're about to see, as Isaac was saying earlier, a Turkish belt being formed even longer across the southern flank of the Russian Federation. And that's a NATO flank, of course. That's the whole, this is NATO influence in Russia's backyard. Again, we know Turkey is a bit of an interesting NATO character, but it's a NATO character nonetheless. And we know that the prophecies say, specifically from St. Gabriel and St. Philomenos, as reiterated by Metropolitan Theophytos of Morphu, is that the Russians will be forced through the Caucasus, and St. Gabriel says Georgia will melt like a candle. They'll be forced through the Caucasus into Turkey and Syria to wage war against the Turks, and that they will ultimately make it all the way to Mount Tabor, where they will then be stopped. And again, this makes a lot of sense with Israel expanding into Syria, why Russia would have to enter what we consider now to be Israel. And of course, the situation, if Latakia is this independent state, that would allow Russia to keep the base. But again, if that doesn't happen, who knows what we're going to see here? I mean, obviously, we know that the Turks control the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, and that in theory, they'd allow the Russians to retreat back up there and never to be let back through again. But then the Turks have succeeded in pushing the Russians back up into Crimea and into the ports that they do have in the south, to the point where they might start challenging them more openly on the Black Sea, more openly supporting the Ukrainians, like we know they have with their drones, especially at the beginning of the war. And we know that just like he does with Israel and rattles the saber and pretends to be against them while still secretly supplying them 40% of their oil, Turkey claims to be neutral on the Russia-Ukraine issue and want to facilitate negotiations. But we know that they still want Crimea to be part of Ukraine. We know that they want to foment ethnic conflict within Russia among their Turkic peoples. And we know that at the end of the day, they're a civilizational enemy of the Russians. And that's where this is going to go. And that's why I was so surprised. And that's why I think Strelkov, who back in 2018 was making this point, that the Russians that are in power, the military leadership, are not paying attention to the reality of the future Turkish conflict and how Turkey is growing in power on their southern flank. And if they were more orthodox and paid attention to the prophecies, they'd be more aware of this. So I think this is, in many ways, sort of the crux of our show. Like, this is kind of why we do the show and why we wish that people that claim to be orthodox and are in these positions of power took that more seriously. The segmenting of your life is, I'm an Orthodox person on Sunday, but when I go to the office at the Russian Ministry of Defense, I'm a good Soviet guy. Like, miss me with all of that. You're going to get yourself into a really terrible geopolitical situation. And next thing you know, Gunther Fellinger is going to be telling you, what your country is going to look like. So we need to start taking this, I think, a bit more seriously, because the prophecies are unfolding and we're witnessing the bad part of it. Yeah, sure, John Vatatzis will come and orthodoxy will spread. But before that, there's going to be, the Turks are going to take a lot of territory and it's going to get really bad before the Russians finally turn on them. So that's what we're seeing right now. And so obviously I want to hear your thoughts on that, GSP, but one of the facts, you talked about the HTS and the future of them aligning with Russia. What is the current status of relations between the HTS and the very much more overtly Turkish-backed Syrian National Army?
Well, they do recognize each other. So the embassy
not
now
the SDF,
in Syria,
but they were forced to recognize each other, but not the SDF. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So there is that. They do recognize each other. I imagine that the Americans will exert enormous pressure, as well as the Israelis, but to the Israelis to a lesser extent, to push the Russians out of Syria completely. The Turks as well. Now, if this is the case, then the Russians' only other option is to help the Kurds against Turkey. Because what would happen, for instance, if the Turks completely wipe out the Kurds? Right? Like, on some level, the Turks know the further they push against the Kurds, the more that Russia can take advantage of them. I personally do not believe America is going to abandon the Kurds, primarily because Israel doesn't want the Kurds abandoned. And when you look at Azerbaijan and the deals that they have with them, you would have to conclude the same thing.
And just for the record, as we had just talked about it, the prophecies do talk about there being an independent Kurdistan when all of this is said and done, including an expanded Armenia.
Very interesting. Yeah. So I think And Erdogan knows the limits of this. Now, it is very troubling when you see how many HTS guys are not just Turkmen from Syria, because they exist there, but Turkmen from Turkmenistan and Tajiks,
And
right?
Uyghurs.
And Uyghurs, right? Like, it's true that these guys proclaim that they just want one gigantic Muslim caliphate. That's the state, right? But then the Uyghurs, well, they want something separate in China, right? I'm sure that some of the other fighters, like the Chechens, want a separate Chechnya in Russia. So, like, that's another area where there could be fissures and a splitting of ways. I'm not yet convinced that HTS and the other various factions in Syria are able to do anything. I mean, everything that they have has been funded and given to them, right? HTS cannot come up with night vision goggles. It cannot fight without Elon Musk and whatnot. Like, all of this depends on, so it's kind of like the Ukrainians, right?
I mean,
There
they
is
relied on
nothing that they
artillery
can
support
do.
from
Yeah,
the Turkish border forces. I mean,
that's right.
that's
That's right. There is nothing that these people can do. They are purely mercenaries, which is the same thing with Ukraine. They are purely an American mercenary army. It doesn't matter whether they go to Africa or they helped out the HTS or Al Qaeda or whatever you want to call them in Syria. The fact of the matter is, they're both mercenary armies. Nothing that they can do. Like, the only thing that keeps them alive is the money and a dream of the future. Like, that's it, right? And again, you saw this with Osama bin Laden, right? He thinks that eventually the time will come after he does this great favor for Brzezinski and the Americans in Afghanistan, that he's going to, he's going to free the Muslim world. He's going to kick the Americans out of Saudi Arabia, right? Noble aspirations. I don't blame him. However, he can't do it, right? He just can't do it. He's not going to persuade enough people. As long as the elites say no, it's no. If the elites still have the will in a country to remain in power, they will find a way. And so I think it's the same thing with HTS. I understand the theory that Russia now can fund, that whole triad of Iran, China, and Russia can fund HTS, can do all these things to hurt Israel. But the fact of the matter, and I think there's already there's already displeasure amongst these Al Qaeda type groups in Syria towards Israel to some degree. But again, it's very low level. It's not Jelani saying this. And we'll just have to see how much crow they can take. Because as Isaac pointed out, the sanctions are still in place. The Kurds are still getting all the oil. Israel's getting 40% of that oil. They haven't gotten rid of the Kurds. America's not going to tolerate a situation where HTS is running the show in Syria. That can't be.
And I'd
Again, these
also like to
people.
point out real quick that, again, the Israelis destroyed all of Syria's military infrastructure. All of the air, yeah.
Yeah, they're afraid of what these guys will do
I
because
don't
they
even
know.
think it's necessarily that. I think it's just simply to keep the country neutered as a whole, so that it doesn't, so that no one. Because here's the problem: a lot of this infrastructure has been built since the early '60s. Hafez al-Assad and Bashar, both of them worked hard to build an actual serious military infrastructure with the air defense and the missile launch sites and apparently a lot of
Right.
underground bunkers and silos. This is all gone now. This means
Yes,
that
I saw the underground stuff.
yeah. And this means that not only that HGS isn't going to get any of it, no one is ever going to get any of it. So
Right.
even if it's some democratic or secular or nationalistic government that takes over, they've got to build from scratch. And this was meant specifically to neuter Syria,
Yep.
so that no one will take control. If HTS doesn't have access to this, they can't secure the country.
Yeah, well, I mean, last week when I recorded, when it was just Constantine and myself, I said Erdogan will take Aleppo and Netanyahu will take Damascus.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're seeing. I mean, and just to So everyone understands the situation in the north. This is from Hakan Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister. He said the current goal is to eliminate the organizations PKK and YPJ in Syria. Either this organization dissolves itself or we will destroy it. So I guess we're seeing a Gaza type operation into de facto Kurdistan in Syria from the Turks. And we hear that the SDF in Raqqa is panicking. I think the Turks are going in seriously. And I just want people to emphasize how, again, we had Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos on. He said he's more secular. He is Orthodox, but but very secular. He himself,
Yes.
doesn't exactly see the vision of a future Russian-Turkish conflict. Yet here we are, me and GSP talking pure geopolitics about the potential for the Russians backing the Kurds against the Turks. And you would have already known that was going to happen if you just paid attention to what St. Paisios said.
The funny thing is that Spengler, over 100 years ago, said that the instinct of the Russians, because of course Spengler has this very kind of metaphysical and almost not quite esoteric, but kind of metaphysical idea of nations and destinies. And he said that the instinct for the Russians will be to push south and east. I find that interesting because, like, in and of itself, like, again, we return to why are they there? There's no one in the region that wants them there, except, of course, Assad and, the Christians and the Alawites. But that's all gone now. Even this is a minuscule number of people. And except for Syria, no other state actor. And it has been that way for decades.
Oh, and that's because, Spengler had, respect for the civilization of the Russians, and everyone thinks, the Russian civilization, their destiny is to push into Europe. And we saw, when they pushed into Europe, that was bad. That was communist. That was the Jewish victory in World War II. But I think I think when the Russians pushed south and east, I think that's the Russian Empire that was, backed by God, when they were fighting the Turks in the Crimean Wars, when they were operating against the Khazars and these other people in the Caucasus Mountains. That was the Roman Empire. That was what I view as the late Roman Empire, not the Constantinopolitan Eastern Roman Empire as well, which was Roman, but that continued on into the Russian Empire and then it was bastardized with the Jewish push in World War II. But before we leave the Levant, we have to go. I want to get Isaac's perspective on these developments in the West Bank. We got Yoav Gallant, the supposed moderate, the Democrats' favorite guy in the Jewish state, talking about how West Bank, total control of the West Bank by Israel is a necessity in the next 10 to 20 years. So, Isaac, what's going on? They seem to just realize that they can take as much of the pie as they want. Greater Israel is real. Netanyahu must be busy. He's going to all these new places that Israel is going to get. That's what it seems to look like to me. We know that you mentioned the future potential Gaza ceasefire, but it seems like the West Bank might be up next. What's going on?
Once the ceasefire in Gaza happens, which, again, very soon we're going to see PIJ and Hamas realize they have to just call it quits because, again, the technology ramp only goes one way. Once they do that and they just consistently starve the population and just destroy it and decimate it, at least 250,000 are dead in my estimation, if not a little more. At this point, at least 250,000 are dead. They're going to start settling northern Gaza. Whatever is left of what they don't settle in northern Gaza, as they continue to push and cram the Palestinians and what's left of Gaza, they are going to turn into an ultimate dystopian concentration camp worse than what we saw before, where you'll have, as the former General David Petraeus say, quote-unquote gated communities within Gaza that are going to be monitored with facial recognition technology cameras, robot machine guns, which they already have, not just in the West Bank, but they had on the wall that separated Gaza from Israel, but they're going to have them all throughout Gaza itself, and biometric security, so that in order to get into a particular quote-unquote gated community, you have to, fingerprint or your eye, an eye scan, an iris scan of some sort. And it's going to be incredibly even more dystopian.
A nose measurement, perhaps?
Conrad, GSP, maybe this is a bit of consumer reference, as it were, but have either of you ever played Half-Life 2?
My brother was good at that game. I never did. I watched him play. I might have played once.
How about you, Conrad?
I have not.
No one's played this game. It's one of the greatest games of 2004, but Conrad, that's your fault. You're a Zoomer. Very disappointing. You hate to see it. But the reason why I bring it up and I tell people who've played this game is that if you remember City 17, and if you remember being in the city and how the aliens were in control of the city and how dystopian and hellscapish it was with the literal robot machine guns and the cameras everywhere and the random raids and the arrests and the walls that literally physically moved, crushing the city in bit by bit. That's literally not only what the West Bank is, that's what's Gaza going to be. Gaza is exactly going to be like that. So if you've played Half-Life 2 and GSP, if you remember your brother playing the game and you saw what City 17 and Combine were like, that's literally not only what the West Bank is, that's what's Gaza going to be, but it's going to be worse in so many ways. Northern Gaza is going to be settled. They're going to rebuild Gush Katif. They're going to feel very happy with themselves. In terms of the West Bank, the fact of the matter is that the West Bank was practically annexed February of last year, when control of the West Bank was given over, or at least the Israeli parts of the West Bank, as it were, was moved from the military to the civilian government. Specifically, was given to Bezalel Smotrich in February of 2023, which effectively meant the West Bank was annexed because the government controlled it. And that's part of the impetus and part of the reason as to why Hamas had attacked on October 7th, alongside the fears and the threats of Al-Aqsa being destroyed and the consistent fears of the Abraham Accords and a whole host of other things. But what we're going to see is an official annexation of the West Bank. They're going to seize more land. They're going to force more people off their homes. I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if they started engaging in airstrikes in places like Jenin or Tulkarm or Nablus, because they did a couple, at least, with choppers, with helicopters in the past year. And I wouldn't be surprised specifically because you're saying Bezalel Smotrich said it openly in a video, and I posted this on my Twitter feed, where he said that we're going to annex the West Bank and the Palestinians are going to be given three options. The first option is to accept residency without political rights, which means no voting and no real civil or political rights. Basically means you'll be fourth-class citizens, right? And subjugated, basically like apartheid in South Africa. That's the first option. The second option is to leave, and they will help you leave. They will help you leave. Third option is if you don't accept the first, if you don't accept the second, if you fight back, we're going to kill you. And this is going to be the end result. The PLO, especially once Mahmoud Abbas dies, is going to be dissolved. The PA will be dissolved, or at the very least, it will be put under direct Israeli control. And I mean, either the cause is permanently over, or it's going to hibernate for a very long time, and hopefully, God willing, it resurrects in some other form. This is the fear I have with HTS: is that while one could say that Palestinian refugees being forced into Jordan or being forced into Egypt is going to be a red line for these countries, and they're going to do something. No. I'm doubtful they'll actually do anything. At least Egypt. I'm doubtful the Egyptians will do anything. Frankly, the Arabs and the Sunni world has proven itself very complacent and willing to watch the Palestinians die. They've watched 250,000 die in the past 15 months. What do you think they're gonna do when they're all expelled into Egypt? The only real place where it's a real concern would be the Jordanian government, because 60% of Jordan is Palestinian. And if the vast majority of the Palestinians of the West Bank and of East Jerusalem are expelled directly into Jordan, then possibly those Palestinians will rise up and take over and overthrow the government. In fact, actually, what's very frightening is, again, with HTS. I am convinced that Jordan's the next target for HTS, possibly. If not the Iraq, I think it's going to be Jordan. Because if the West Bank is taken, if Palestinians are expelled, and if the Jordanian government does nothing, which they will do literally nothing, because this is a government propped up by the Americans. This is not a popular government at all, and it is a government that can be very brutal. I have a Palestinian friend of mine who lives in Germany. She and her family lives in Germany, but she has Jordanian citizenship, and I know that her family, at least her parents, have Jordanian citizenship. She lives in Germany, and we were speaking on Telegram, And she was afraid to say anything again, she was afraid to really harshly criticize the Jordanian government in our conversation on Telegram, because she's afraid of whatever influence that the Jordanian intelligence services, the mukhabarat as they were, might have, and she doesn't want to cause problems for herself or her family next time she goes to Jordan. With HTS, I'm afraid of HTS saying is, see, here, look at what the descendants of the prophets have come down to. We're going to liberate Jordan. We're going to institute true Islamic law and true Sharia. And they'll do that. And the Israelis will see it as an excuse to annex territory east of the Jordan River. And more specifically, they'll say, okay, the kingdom of Jordan is gone. Now the Palestinians can control their own state, and they have their own nation in accordance to their own destiny. What need or what use do we have of the Arabs here? Besides forcibly expelling all the Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza, they're going to start repressing the Arabs or the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And there's going to be real talk about having their citizenship stripped and them being pushed out as well. And who's going to stop them? That's the thing that I think people haven't realized. No one has stopped them. Really, that's just, by the end of the day, that's what happened. No one has actually stopped them from doing anything. The only people who have shown any real courage throughout there's only two groups of people that have shown real courage throughout all of this. The Lebanese people who have suffered as well in the month-and-a-half war that killed 4,000 Lebanese, and the hundreds of Hezbollah fighters that fought bravely, and for whom I am eternally grateful for their sacrifice, and for whom I am eternally grateful for Hassan Nasrallah and his sacrifice. You'll have to excuse me. I'm trying not to be emotional here. But Hassan Nasrallah was a hero to so many people. I cannot begin to explain what a loss that was. He is a once-in-a-generation leader. He is a once-in-a-lifetime leader. You don't get people like him. Naim Qasim, this new guy, God bless his soul, but he's no Nasrallah. No one was Nasrallah. And Nasrallah was right in the speech he said that if Syria falls, Palestine falls. He was right. And right now, the so-called Ummah is too blinded in its overall, frankly, just irrational hatred of Shia to see that. And
well, I think that unfortunately, it's a testament to the victory of secularism, because I think in any other time, this grade of a shakeup in the Islamic world would have led to religious realignment. But no one's talking about that. That doesn't seem to be what's going on.
Well, I think by the end of the day, this is the thing about the Arabs, is that the Arabs of Levant need to realize that a secular nationalism, a secular Arab nationalism, and when we say secular and when the West says secular, it means two different things, right? When the West says secular, they mean gay global homo, right? When we say secular, we mean governments that respect and institutions and help them flourish. The Assad regime was secular, and the Assad regime had always been even at its lowest.
Yeah, it was secular, but you couldn't call it atheist. You know what I mean?
No. The Assad regime was interested in seeing the communities flourish. It helped build churches. It helped maintain Shia shrines. And of course, it was very active in the preservation of Sunni mosques and traditions. I mean, of course, the Assad regime, the Grand Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, the Assad regime certainly wasn't going to see that go to disrepair. That's what we mean by secular government, that while not overtly aligned to one religion, had respect for all the communities, because the Levant truly is a natural tapestry. People talk about the Levant has a natural diversity going back literal millennia. You've had a whole host of people that have been part of this land for 4, 5, 6,000 years, and their descendants are still here today. This is something to be cherished and beloved and preserved, not something where all these groups are forced to be sterilized or dominated by Salafist jihadism. Secular Arab nationalism was always the best chance we had. Historically speaking, that's just the case. Let's look at Palestine.
I agree.
Let's look at Palestine as the greatest example of this. In the 1920s, the Muslim Christian associations were making the best and the biggest headway against the British mandate and the British colonialism in Palestine. So what happened? The British began funding Islamist parties. Ryan Gosling himself, Haj Amin al-Husseini. I say that because there's a lot of people don't understand is if you Google Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, you'll realize that he's a spitting image of Ryan Gosling. But Haj Amin al-Husseini was made the Grand Mufti, sponsored by the British. His Islamic nationalistic ideology was spread throughout Palestine. Some of the Christians began feeling a little alienated, so they were thinking maybe we should go with the British. Maybe they'll fund our institutions, and maybe they'll give us this, that, and the other thing. And what it did is that it undermined the secular Muslim Christian associations trying to build for Palestinian nationalism. And the end result is that it created Islamic nationalism amongst the Palestinian Muslims, because besides funding the Islamic institutions of the Grand Mufti, Palestinians could not move from village to village around that time. Even then, as bad as it is now, even then, under British mandate, you had to get permission from the British to leave your village to go somewhere else. The only people who could move around were the waqfs, the religious officials, for marriages and funerals and education. And a secular nationalist under the British mandate could not simply go up on the street and pass pamphlets and give speeches. That's an easy way to get disappeared by the British. So the only place where you could vent your frustrations and the only place where people could talk about a free Palestine or a Palestinian state were the imams, the waqfs, and then the mosques. So they created this Islamic radicalism. Or it wasn't even like radical at the time, but Islamic nationalism had its roots at that time, a form of Islamic nationalism. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood played a role in this, because the Muslim Brotherhood by the 30s and the 40s, and of course by the 70s and the 80s, as it eventually morphed into Hamas, had always had a foothold in Gaza.
Isaac, I have to ask, we know that Gaza, obviously, Hamas, they were the legitimate rulers of Gaza up into this day still, but I'm wondering, we saw reports in the West Bank of clashes between, I don't know if these are Hamas affiliated, but more militant groups with Fatah and whatnot. As it becomes clear that Israel is going to take over the West Bank, is that going to become something? We have to move on to Russia soon, but I just want to get your last thoughts. Is that going to be something we see? Are there going to be groups that challenge the Palestinian Authority?
At some point, I think that will be. The problem is that the resistance in the West Bank has been so broken by, it's just a hyper totalitarianism. It's a hyper oppression in the West Bank. Smuggling weapons is so hard. Organizing is so hard. I mean, your phone is constantly monitored in a way that you have to be really careful how you speak. Cameras everywhere, spies everywhere. I mean, the Israelis know how to blackmail Palestinians and how to how to terrify them into becoming collaborators. It's as things worsen for the Palestinians and the PA proves itself unwilling and unable to defend them, I would not be surprised if Hamas or affiliated Islamic Jihad groups, like whether it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad or the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, begins to clash with the PA and declare a third intifada and officially declare a third or fourth intifada at this point against Israel, and against the settlers and just the Jews in the West Bank as a whole. I think that that was the biggest problem. The biggest problem in the 80s wasn't even just in the 80s. The fact of the matter is that by the mid-80s, the sidelining the PFLP, which is a secular organization, secular resistance, which is, besides Hamas, is frankly, actually to this day, the PFLP is actually the only member of the PLO, and if I'm correct, the only organization that actually officially only recognizes Palestine from the river to the sea. The PLO and Fatah recognizes the two-state solution. Even Hamas, in its 2017 charter, recognizes. It does not officially recognize Israel, but the charter claims that a Palestinian state is within the 1967 border, so it indirectly recognizes Israel. The PFLP, which yes it's a Marxist organization founded by an Orthodox Christian, George Habash, The PFLP is the only organization that I know of that recognizes Palestine from the river to the sea and wants a free Palestine from the river to the sea and does not recognize Israel as a legitimate state. And I think that was our biggest mistake, pushing away from the secular organizations and pushing more towards the religious nationalist organizations. Frankly speaking, just have proved themselves time after time incapable of really leading serious resistance or having any real serious leadership capabilities. I mean, God bless these guys, but they just can't do it.
Well, look, at the end of the day, this show is about, the kind of the confluence of the cosmic reality of life and death and God with the geopolitical realities of this world. And Islam
and
is,
I don't say
not true. So at the end of the day, it's not going to be something that can truly, I think this Palestinian struggle is taking on a more worldwide scale. I just don't think that Islam, like you said, it's going to have to be something else, because I don't think Islam is going to be what's done it to them. But we have to move on. There's so much to talk about.
I just want to say, I apologize before you
give your last words.
You do, but my last words are this, and I don't mean this, obviously I don't mean this as an insult or a degradation towards Muslims as a whole, and I definitely don't want, and the last thing I want to do is to insult or degrade the sacrifices that Hamas has made or that the Islamic fighters have made for the struggle of Palestine, like literally giving their blood and their bodies, especially, but going back to even like 1935 with Muhammad Izzuddin al-Qasim, the Sunni cleric that led the first revolt. I mean, both my grandparents fought for him. I cannot disrespect that man. I certainly will not disrespect my grandparents for the sacrifices they made against the British and the Zionists. But the fact of the matter is that his revolt didn't even last a month, and he died, and many of his fighters died. Thankfully, both my grandparents were able to escape the wrath of the British. But the only real effective resistance we had was in 1936 with the secular Palestinian revolt led by the Arab Higher Committee. And Christians and Muslims fought together against this. And the only reason ultimately why it failed is for the same reason why we are losing again here, is that the Arab world ignores it and ignores us and frankly betrays us. And part of the reason why secular nationalism has not really succeeded in the Arab world or the Levant is because by the end of the day, the Arabs betray themselves with their bickering and their infighting. And it's shameful to see. And that, God bless the Palestinians, God bless the Arabs of the Levant, but I fear that there will be much more suffering before we come to peace and unity.
Well, as a white man, I can relate to that. So a lot of bickering preventing us from, resisting Zog. But no, we're obviously praying for the Palestinians. We're praying for the situation in Syria because, unfortunately, again, this is probably one of the more black-pilled shows we've had on World War Now, just because we're not going to get on here and say that there's going to be some kind of powerful government in exile that's going to rally the troops, and in 9 months we're going to have a counteroffensive. Like, that's obviously not happening. So here we are. And as you said, Nasrallah said, if Syria falls, Palestine falls. We're here at the precipice of that to see just how true that really is. We're also at the precipice of this Iranian strike, but they claim they're still going to strike Israel. I don't even know what that would look like, because it used to be these sort of compounding retaliations. Is this retaliation going to also include a retaliation for overthrowing the Syrian government? I highly doubt that. I highly doubt it will be, as they always like to say, proportional and we're going to escalate. I don't think they're going to be able to escalate beyond what happened here. But nonetheless, they claim that strike is coming. So we're going to be watching that closely. Keep your eyes to the ground on Telegram. But it's time to move on to Russia. Maybe, better news, if that's what we call all of these war streams. It's all, depressing with all the loss of life and all of this. But it does appear that the Russians are having they're faring much better in their spheres of influence in the Ukraine front than they are, of course, in Syria. So GSP, I want to get your thoughts, where you're seeing advances all over the place. Kursk still seems to be this sort of frozen debacle, but everywhere else, Russia seems to be advancing quite well.
Yeah, I think for the Russians, Kursk is a kind of double-edged sword. In some respects, it works out for them. There are currently roughly 40,000 Ukrainians in Kursk right now, Ukrainian fighters. There are 10 battalions of various strength. So they're not all like 4,500. Most likely they're around 2,000. Then there are, I think, between 5 to 8 brigades. Battalions are much smaller than that. I meant the brigades are roughly around 4,500, 4,000. But again, we don't know how well manned they are. Like, we don't know what the attrition rate is. There have been exchanges of the dead that have occurred in November. We covered this on the show, and in both cases, absolutely startling. For instance, in the latest case, the Russians received back 87 dead soldiers, and the Ukrainians received back 560. Before that, there was an exchange where about 100 Russians were exchanged for like 512, 520, somewhere around that. So you're seeing like a greater than 5-to-1, 6-to-1 kill ratio. It has gotten into their heads. Of course, the British were behind this Kursk incursion, right? Just as they were with the Kerch Bridge, the one linking mainland Russia, Rostov-on-Don area, roughly speaking, with Crimea. The theory for the British has been that, like, if we can deal a significant blow to something which has like a strong cultural, symbolic nature for the Russians, they will turn on their government, right? And in both cases, it has not worked out. The Russians are not happy about it, but the average Russian accepts it and understands the greater struggle and what they're dealing with in the other parts of Donbass and the other areas. Now, as an update, as I'm speaking to you about these other parts, the Russians made enormous gains from the beginning of October onwards. In fact, territorial gains since June have really ballooned for the Russians. They're now averaging roughly 23 square kilometers a day. This is significantly up. May, there was a bit of a lull, but by the end of June, the Russians began advancing further and further. Now, as far as Kursk, the Ukrainians have lost half the territory that they controlled in Kursk, and the Russians are moving in an area just south of Sudzha. There's only one road linking Sudzha and Sumy, Ukraine. But again, as long as the Ukrainians want to keep 40,000 troops up there instead of holding the Donbass, I think the Russians will take it. In October, of course, Ugledar fell, the fortress, and the Russians made enormous gains since then, pushing north and pushing west. So now the Russians are on the doorstep of Velika Novoselovka. They have overtaken more than half of Korehovo. I think there's a town south of Orehovo that they just captured today called Uspešne. I know that's a Slavic word that we share in common with them, Uspe. Anyways, and of course the Russians have gotten even closer to Pokrovsk. Now they're about 5 or 6 kilometers from the outskirts of Pokrovsk. There have been some attacks where some trenches were retaken by the Ukrainians. But tactically speaking, the Ukrainians really have not been able to withhold the Russians, particularly after February 17th, when the Russians took Avdiivka. As well, Russians have made some progress in Chasiv Yar. And of course, now they have a section in the Kupiansk front across Svatove, which is a hub for the Russians. They've reached the Oskal River, and that area of the Oskal River is tending to expand from north to south, and they've created a pocket on the east bank of the Oskal River where Kupiansk is situated. So basically what I would say is the Russians are continuing to make gains in the Donbass. I mean, I think they will take Pokrovsk, but I think the Ukrainians, the only time the Ukrainians will move to Pokrovsk to stop its overtaking, because we've mentioned on the show countless times, Pokrovsk has no less than like 6 roads, 6 highways that lead in and out of it. It just radiates out all these railroads and regular roads, and it is the last significant defense. After that, there are no more trenches. And if anybody has seen the kind of elaborate trench networks that the Ukrainians built since 2014, People talk about the Surovikin line that was, constructed in like 6 months. Well, I mean, you should see what the Ukrainians have done. But taking Pokrovsk will allow the Russians to flank the Ukrainians from the west. So that is basically what the Russians are focusing on right now. If there's ever going to be a big arrow move by the Russians, which I don't think there will be, it will be only after the fall of Pokrovsk. And the reason for this is, first of all, big arrow moves are very difficult when you're dealing with an adversary that has real-time surveillance, but also real-time surveillance with millions of drones. We know drones now can just take out any kind of armored vehicle. Sometimes they need 3, 4, 5 hits, but eventually it will be damaged and the crew will have to abandon it. So I would say overall, the war for the Russians in Ukraine is going well. And 2024 has very much been their year. Now, you still have the strikes with ATACMS. There was an ATACMS strike in Taganrog. Taganrog is on the Azov Sea on the northern shore. It's not far from Mariupol. There were no casualties, but there have been casualties in Donbass because of strikes by the Ukrainians, like on civilians in Donetsk. And there was an officer that was killed in Donetsk with a improvised explosive device that was planted in his car. This is something I haven't seen in like literally in a year and a half happen. That was something that happened much more frequently in early 2022. I don't think necessarily it means that old trend is returning. It's not going to be as common thing again that we saw, particularly in March, April, all the way to August, really, of 2022. There was an oil refinery that the Ukrainians hit. It translates to black gold. It's in a town north of Ukraine, south of Moscow. I believe it's Orel or Oryol. So anyways, I would say for the Russians, they'll keep this pace. They have enough men. They can replenish them. There's enough volunteers. They don't have to. I think they definitely don't want to have another partial mobilization. Not for now, unless the situation becomes really dire. They have enough armaments. When you hear with the Ukrainians, their main complaint is, yeah, we could draft more people. We could probably drag more people off the street to fill up the ranks, but we don't have the armaments, the munitions, the guns to supply them. And an interesting thing that I don't know if it was Graham Lindsay that said it, but it's one of the American politicians who said that if you can begin drafting those 18 and older, you'll get the armaments. So again, it's this carrot and stick that's being offered. So all this time, they were withholding, I guess, armaments to Ukraine because Ukraine didn't want to sacrifice its youth. They already reduced the age of conscription from 27 to 25 this year. And the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, struck down the law, but they have found loopholes around this where they basically offer young men, we'll pay for your university if you go to the front. Now, how well is this really going to work out? I don't know. I have my doubts. So anyways, I would say that for the Russians, Ukraine is going quite well. There are already talks that 2025 will be the year of negotiations. Doesn't mean the war will stop because many wars do proceed even in the midst of negotiations. But that would be my synopsis.
No, that's what I've been reading about as well. Pretty much a similar analysis. I think the situation in Pokrovsk, if that falls completely here in the next anytime soon, that's going to be extremely disastrous for the entire Ukrainian front. And I mean, right now, we're hearing more rumors they want more F-16s. They only ever operate those F-16s over in the far west of Ukraine because they do not want those to get shot down because they know the moment one gets shot down, they're not getting any more. So I think
if Syrian S-200 and Buk air defense can shoot down F-16s, then the S-300s and the S-400s and whatever else the Russians have can do it. Yeah, Pokrovsk is important. I expect this to be a bit of a slog, frankly. I think they're going to push a lot into this. Excuse me. But with that being said, so this might be another Bakhmut almost in terms of its intensity and length. But once Pokrovsk breaks, which it will, and the Russians will push everything into breaking it, then Zaporozhye and Dnipro are next. Literally, there are no more trenches. There's nothing else. Like was it Donetsk is 50 miles away from the front now, or 50 kilometers, excuse me, which means that's generally out of it should be out of most artillery range. If Oreshniks are being used, which I think, frankly speaking, they should be used at this point, I think the Russians need to start just upping the pace of destruction and upping the pace of their use of force, especially with their.
Well, there's rumors of an incoming Oreshnik strike later this week, and they have been using the Black Sea more and more with the strikes on Odessa, Nikolaev, and all of these places. So, Isaac, I think you're right when you say that Zaporozhye is definitely going to be next. I think the Russians don't want to go into any kind of negotiations before they control, at the very least, all of the oblasts that they, constitutionally recognize.
I'm not even sure they're interested in. I'm not even sure they're even really interested in negotiations. They want all 4 oblasts they currently control. They want NATO demilitarized and frankly neutered, and they might even go further. Dnipro, Kharkov, Sumy, or Chernigov, or possibly even just straight up to everything that's on the east of the Dnieper River, if not Odessa. I still think that Odessa is possibly still on the menu. I hope it is.
No, I agree. I think for a number of reasons, but based on, obviously we can't wishful thinking would be if we trusted the word of all of the, governmental leaders of Kherson and Zaporozhye region, because they're obviously ultra-nationalists. But it seems that with the strikes that I've been seeing and the intensity on the Black Sea coast, I don't know what, they strike Odessa a lot more than they strike, Lvov. So I think they understand what needs to be done, and they want to go into any kind of negotiations with this in mind. But I'm not sure about the future of negotiations. Personally, I think the Turks are going to try to put pressure on for negotiations, and I'm wondering what that's going to look like.
My personal take is that the Russians are not going to go west once Pokrovsk falls. They're going to go north. So there's a string of villages immediately adjacent. Well, there are villages, but there's a string of towns and cities north of Pokrovsk, which is in Chasiv Yar, right? So Chasiv Yar is the highest point in eastern Ukraine, and the Russians control roughly 50% of it right now. If Chasiv Yar falling is just as important as Pokrovsk, this is why both of them falling would be very important. Now, the cities that run as a string north of Chasiv Yar are Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk. And they're big, and they kind of meld one into the other with smaller villages linking them. You're looking at a population pre-war definitely in the hundreds of thousands. And they're fortified. Now, the thing is, if going head on from the east to the west against these villages is very costly in terms of human lives and military material. So if you want these places to fall, you take Pokrovsk, you go north, and now you have flanked them from the east and the west. That's the area that has to fall, right? One of the reasons that the Russians made so many gains in 2022, people talk about the counteroffensive of the Ukrainians, but even with that, the Russians went from controlling something 11% or 9% of Ukraine to, which is now roughly 20% of Ukraine, because those forces refused to move from the east of Ukraine, right? And the Russians never had enough forces in 2022 to flank them from the other side. So it was a pointless exercise in that regard to do that. I think they were hoping that they could reach some settlement. That nearly happened in Istanbul or Ankara or wherever. I think it was in Istanbul that it was held. And in any case, it never happened. So I think what you're going to see is a push north from Pokrovsk once it falls, because they have to. That's where most of the Ukrainian forces are, is Russia can travel into all these other areas towards Zaporozhye and Dnipro if they wanted to. Yeah, okay. But what do you're still not dealing with this really thick line of towns and cities and trench networks that are right against all those territories from the early days of the war back from 2014 and later on, once the SMOs started. So that's my take. That's what I think is going to happen. I agree with you guys that it would be very strange if the Russians would make a deal with Blumph, only because it would be looked at as it wouldn't be looked at as a victory. I mean, I know Trump says he's going to end the war, and now he's sort of saying, well, I can't really end it in 24 hours. Campaign Trump is one thing, and Trump in office is another thing.
And I would just like to say that it's not just campaign. Campaign Trump is one thing. Real life Donald Trump, frankly, has proven himself to be a pushover to the neocons. Because remember, he was the one that started arming Ukraine in his first administration. And he is the one that told the Ukrainians to flaunt the Minsk agreements. And
He does very schizophrenic, like Netanyahu wants him to bomb Syria, but he doesn't really bomb them. On the other hand, he wants to withdraw. On the other hand, he wants to withdraw troops from Syria and Kosovo. So, like, the reason everything is so schizophrenic is because he can't get what he wants, and so he does something to appease them, and then he doesn't do something that angers them. I think, I really think that Netanyahu believed that Trump in office would give him the victory in Syria that they got this year. And I think that's why.
Yeah, I think agree. I think that's very true, yeah.
And I think he believes that he's going to give them the West Bank. And I think that that's likely. And we even see reports now that Trump has been talking about preemptively striking Iran's nuclear capabilities, apparently, to give them a warning or something like that. So that tying into what could go on in Ukraine, though, I could see Trump basically being willing to give up more territory than pretty much any Jew in the State Department would like, for then to get the go-ahead on more aggressive strikes on Iran. That's something that I've been talking about for a long time on the show.
Well, the question is, I was going to say real quick, the question is, and I guess we can wrap this part of the discussion up, the question becomes, will the State Department even allow that? Mike Waltz is a Ukraine hawk. Pete Hesketh, Hesketh isn't even going to be the Secretary of Defense anymore. I don't know who's going to replace him, but I promise you it's a Zionist who's also a Russia hawk on Ukraine. Most of this cabinet, and most of not just the cabinet, but the people who will be in charge of hiring for the new administration and the people who will be funneling information to the Oval Office, to the president, are basically Russia hawks in some form or another.
Yeah, I think people make an assumption that Trump will give Ukraine to Russia for Syria. But I think the real deal is Trump will give Ukraine to Russia for Iran.
Yeah, I think we're going to see that. And unfortunately, I think the question is Trump going to get aggressive on Iran or soft on Ukraine first? And that's going to indicate if things are going to go, maybe, it'll get bad, but it'll be generally better, or if it's really just going to get worse. And I think that's what we have to be praying about. But Isaac, he has to leave us. He's a working tradesman, so he's got to get to bed. But Isaac, we are praying for your family, of course, in Palestine. We are praying for the Arab world. We are praying for just the whole situation. So thank you so much for your analysis. And obviously we have all of your stuff linked down below.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you for having me. God bless you all. And pray for Palestine. Pray for the people of the Levant. I will definitely be praying for not just Russia and the faithful in Ukraine, but for the faithful in Romania and, of course, the faithful in Georgia, which you guys will be talking about pretty soon. Have a good night.
Take care. We'll pray for you.
God bless, man. No, it's always good to have Isaac when we talk about the Levant. It would seem, I've got him in the Rolodex. It would seem inappropriate to not bring him in because he knows a lot. But, GSP,
he really does.
We've beat the Russian-Ukrainian horse at this point. I think it's time to talk about the satellites. The situation in Georgia is, I almost don't know what to think. Normally, I would be concerned because it would be one of the more concerning news developments of the week. But with everything else going on, I don't know. I don't think the Georgian color people, I don't think the Zog forces really have it in them. I don't know. It seems that the Georgian Dream have a solid grasp on the situation. The mayor of Tbilisi and the police forces seem to have generally kept the situation under control. Zurabashvili is literally having to blame Christmas tree lightings and these are political stunts. Like, well, it's Christmas time. Okay. When are they supposed to do the Christmas stuff in the city? I don't think you can just say that it's a political stunt to block your stupid protests for gay marriage. So I'm wondering your thoughts on Georgia. Zurabishvili, of course, is saying that the elections that are going to be on Sunday are illegitimate, that she's going to reject them, and that she's not going to step down, despite the fact that her deadline to step down is on December 28th. So GSP, I'm curious your thoughts on the situation.
Well, just before I get into that, a day or two ago, there was a coffin with something like some paraphernalia in the coffin representing the church, and it was lit on fire in Tbilisi. This is what the protesters were doing.
Oh, I saw. I think the church had to condemn them. And
yeah.
So,
these are pathetic people. So, I mean, I find it interesting that in 2024, you have Macron refusing to step down. You have Zurabishvili refusing to step down. All these people refusing to step down. And then in Romania, you have Georgescu basically sidelined because they didn't like the results of the first round of elections there. You have Sandu in Moldova literally rigging an election.
Yep.
And so, like, one of the things I think with Trump's election, the way the narrative changed in America, because, America controls all these little vassal states anyways, and this has emanated throughout the EU and in Britain, is this idea of democracy is not the popular will. And we understand, like, basically they're the moral Brahmin of democracy. And it's the institutions of democracy, not the actual votes, right? So, I mean, that's a contradiction to some degree because they're still willing to have elections and they're still willing to call themselves a democracy. But there's more emphasis on being liberal than democratic, right? But I agree. So I think that's kind of like an interesting phenomenon. The other thing is, I'm considerably older than you are. I can remember a time where this could never happen. I mean, yes, the Americans could go into some South American country and, have a coup of a democratically elected president, for instance. But, this kind of rhetoric wasn't there. I don't remember it. And you see a lot more of this rhetoric in many ways. Like, the American empire cannot make these concessions. It has to create a new narrative each time to keep propelling itself forward, because it's invested a lot of money into Georgia, and not least of all because they want to reroute pipelines from the north of Iran. That's one of the other reasons they want to see Iran fall, and essentially turn Turkey into a giant gas hub. It already is one, but a bigger one. But it's mainly to supply gas to Europe without Russian gas, because American LNG coming over in ships is not viable. The EU is now purchasing more Russian gas vis-a-vis, third-party states. But before I keep wandering off topic, yeah, I agree with you. I don't. The Georgia Dream Party has handled things very well. I don't see the protesters really making an effect. Some of the things that the Georgians are doing that the Ukrainians were not in 2014 is they're not trying to make concessions with the protesters. They've including today, they've reiterated that Zurabishvili is illegitimate. She lost. It's over. Get real. You can talk about you're not leaving. You're leaving. And Yanukovych never made those kinds of statements. He was constantly trying to juggle both sides. And, his Berkut forces often felt betrayed. And, a lot of them gave up. A lot of them were maimed and killed as well. I don't see yet, because, of course, by the 28th of December, Zurabishvili, she has to leave. So, we're still 2 weeks away from that. A little over 2 weeks away from that. Yeah, I think so. About 2 weeks. And so, I mean, anything can happen. And you mentioned off air before we started recording that the guys, the Georgian Legion in Ukraine is no more. They've dissolved it. They've They've come back. That's a horrible portent because, it was the Georgians who killed some of the protesters in Maidan Square in February 2014 and January 2014. So, are they going to be mobilized to do the same thing? I would say so far, what will throw in doubt this narrative is that the level of violence has not been there as it was in Ukraine. That preceded the mass shootings that we saw.
Mm-hmm.
About 100 people were sniped, and neither Ukraine nor the West have ever done an investigation into this. Despite all the ranting and raving about it, because they know the evidence will show that it wasn't secret Russian agents or the Ukrainian police department that killed these people.
Yeah, I think the situation in Georgia is, like you said, if these guys that have been training in Ukraine, been fighting in Ukraine for the past 2 years are able to, like, I don't know, set up some kind of defensive position in the city and actually start doing something that could become problematic. But again, I think the Georgians are able to do, like you said, they're able to do what Yanukovych couldn't do because they can just look at Ukraine and be like, we don't want to become like that. That's why this is happening. They can look at that and they can basically, because what Yanukovych couldn't do was do anything that made him look too pro-Russian, because that would just feed the propaganda machine. The Georgians can kind of get away with doing things that people are like, see, you're doing the pro-Russian thing, because the vast majority of Georgians are Orthodox who don't want anything to do with the EU Globo Homo stuff. And then when it comes to the politics, they can kind of go either way at this point. So they're able to just be like, look, we don't want to become Ukraine 2.0. We'd rather just grit our teeth and deal with the freaking Russians at this point. And the majority of Georgians, 55+%, generally seem to be okay with that. And that's how it's going to go. The other unfortunate situation is Romania. They're on the opposite end of the spectrum. There's not even going to be protests in the other direction.
No.
This is just over. And just to prove how firm the regime is on this and how there's not going to be any kind of, international checks and balances, of course, Realitatea Plus, the only major news channel in Romania to criticize the suspension of democracy, they've been penalized by the authorities with measures including a 10-minute suspension during which the channel cannot be on air, on top of, financial penalties. So
that's ridiculous.
Everybody's getting, if you just say anything, and again, the evidence they've claimed is that Georgescu was unfairly advantaged on TikTok. Well, maybe people on TikTok just liked him more. Maybe he just made better TikToks.
As far as I know, TikTok doesn't have a ban. As far as I know, yeah, I know, right? As far as I know, TikTok does not ban anyone representing, the Romanian regime, the NATO-aligned Romanian regime. Anybody can make the videos. This is stupid. This is ridiculous. Again, this is the morality of democracy. They understand what real democracy is. Here's how to have an actual fair election. The Russians have just enormous influence everywhere. They're a gas station. They're poor, but also they're incredibly wealthy. Can pay off anybody. It's just ridiculous.
Well, and the point you made earlier when we were talking about the Arabs in the Middle East, why are there not going to be any protests in Romania? Because the largest NATO base in Europe is in Romania. So what are they going to do? Yeah. Who are they going to it's not even, it's a non-starter. So this idea that, again, it'll probably influence future elections if people can remember this and, people on the ground can keep this in the collective consciousness. There's a chance the next election, somebody as a sort of protest is able to win an even larger margin. But at this point, who cares? What does that even mean? It's all fake. It doesn't matter who you vote for. They'll just do this. So at the end of the day, obviously I'm in the United States. I don't advocate for political violence. I support, the government. Donald Trump is the president. It's all good. But in Europe, they've been quite aware for a long time of how to operate outside of the democratic process, and that sometimes violence and focused violence, I'm not even saying civil war uprising, focused acts of violence need to be enacted to break free of a totalitarian, completely oppressive system. And these countries like Romania, they've been at that point for a long time now. And if more people don't realize that, I'm not sure what's going to save some of these countries besides, divine intervention, which we just have to be praying for at this point. But unless you have anything else to say about Romania and Georgia, we have to talk about the ongoing situation in Africa, because again, I feel like I'm saying Somalia is collapsing. I mean, Somalia been collapsing, but the situation, it seemed like it was about to get better with an agreement reached between Mogadishu and Ethiopia. Ethiopia is not going to be recognizing Somaliland independence, and Mogadishu, I think, is basically just going to allow them to have access to the Red Sea in a way that is beneficial to them. But as that happened, Jubaland basically completely declared war on Mogadishu, and with Ethiopian help have been advancing against their forces. So they kind of did the old switcheroo. Somaliland became a bit more normal, but now Jubaland in the south it's the same situation, just on the other side of the country. So obviously we know Somalia only is even existent in its current form because of the help of these Arab League states like Egypt and Turkey. They have defense forces there that, in fact, Turkey and Egypt and these other places sharply criticized Somalia because the Mogadishu government deployed Egyptian and Turkish forces that were meant for Somaliland and other disputes. They deployed them against Jubaland forces in the south, which was completely unauthorized. I mean, this is the equivalent of, the Ukrainians launching ATACMS before they were given, the green light. So this is obviously a bit of a diplomatic kerfuffle, but obviously the situation in Africa it's the ultimate proxy war continent. We have the same situation in Sudan with the UAE perpetually denying their support for the rapid support forces. Meanwhile, Russia and Egypt have all kind of coalesced around supporting the Sudanese government. Another situation where Russia has been promised a naval base on the Red Sea by the government there. And then meanwhile, we have the Sahel. We have recent news about how France apparently had all these plans for like a direct war against Russia, but the other options were always to fight against Wagner with these asymmetrical militias in Africa, but that never played out because they just left. Like we obviously saw that happen in Mali, Burkina Faso, and it's happening apparently in Chad now as well, which we're going to keep watching that closely. But Isaac talked about Libya, but yeah, the situation in Africa is generally the situation with Ethiopia and Somalia. Israel is on the side of Ethiopia in many ways, but Russia on Ethiopia, Somalia, it's kind of bridging both worlds. But if you have any thoughts on Africa, I'd love to hear them, GSP, before we then talk about Myanmar.
Yeah. I mean, I was completely surprised by the events. Not that I keep a close eye on Somalia anyways. I do think about how does this tie in with the Houthis? Because, after the fall of Syria, what is Iran's reach? How does this affect Yemen in relation to what's happening in Somalia? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Sudan, I think, would definitely affect the situation. Will the Israelis go to, I mean, the Israelis really can't do anything about Yemen. But how well can Yemen survive? What will Saudi Arabia do in this region? That's the interesting thing. Will they be renewed in spirit after conquering Syria to betray the Yemenis? One small thing I just wanted to say about Romania is that Romania, like one of the things that America has wanted for forever, just as the British did a century or two before, is to cut Russia off completely from the Baltic and from the Black Sea. And the reason the Americans are building the largest NATO base ever in Romania is they don't. Number one, can you imagine Romania on good terms? They generally are on good terms with the Serbs and with Hungary. That would give access. That would have direct access with Russian ships. Like it would never happen. It could never happen. And then, if there's a NATO base there, it's over. Like you have to think like a revolutionary, not like a patriot. So you can't get sucked into, well, if I just help NATO defeat Russia, then they'll let me be independent. No, that's not going to happen. But yeah, I suppose we can move on to the Sahel. I read a little bit about that France, because even the Americans have actually left Niger, and which was honestly, that was a surprise. I thought they would hold on, but they haven't. Like the French before them, they've left.
Yeah, I think the African situation is, you mentioned earlier in our conversation about Syria, who are Russia's allies on the Mediterranean. There's a chance they shift their focus here towards Libya to try to really, have the Haftar aligned government take complete power of the country. Libya could maybe become Syria 2.0 for the Russians if they're able to somehow consolidate that mess, which I'm not necessarily saying that they can, but they obviously are probably going to start using the ports that they have access to there if they can a bit more now that the situations in Latakia and Tartus have been threatened. But in Asia, we obviously have to talk about Myanmar. We're going to be able to breeze through this really quickly, but reports that 149 officers of the Tatmadaw junta were killed in November. This comes from obviously the Ministry of Defense in exile, and of course more and more reports continue to come in of the PDF and these rebel forces taking more and more territory from the junta. But at the same time, we have heard news that China is increasing their support. We remember the Ministry of Defense for the junta finally visited China for the first time in years a few months back. So I think with China, you mentioned, they kind of gave up on Syria. China seems to be even giving up on Iran in some capacity, but I think they realize they can't give up something that has a border with them like Myanmar to this Western-backed faction, of course. And we know that, Aung San Suu Kyi, they still hope to bring, all these people back into the fold, and all of the the neoliberal people there. And again, these are huge countries with huge populations. Myanmar, well over 60 million people. They want to do the same thing in Thailand, which in some capacity they did with the whole milk tea rebellion situation. So, Southeast Asia is going to become more and more of a proxy war, color revolution center now that in Europe and Africa, things kind of start to settle into a more, they've picked their side, whether it's Russia and China or the US and NATO in a lot of these places. But I think one of the final things we have to talk about, I have to mention that Pope Francis, he visited the fake Metropolitan Epiphany Poopmenko, the schismatic leader in Ukraine. And, they're talking about, obviously, ecumenical issues. And obviously, to me, it's just the slow creep of the eventual 2025 ecumenical attempt at reunion. We know there's going to be the joint, Easter celebration on the Gregorian and on the Julian calendars. And we know that the Ukrainians, they already started celebrating things on the new calendar. They had new calendar Christmas already this year. They've abandoned the old calendar for foolish reasons. Like, I believe, I'm a fan of the old calendar myself, but I think the situation in Ukraine, obviously, the persecution against the church has started. They don't have as much energy for that because more and more people are getting forced to the front lines, but they've turned their attention to just claiming fake persecution stories on the other side of the front lines from the Russians, which have no basis in reality whatsoever, trying to, foment unrest behind the scenes, I guess, to, bolster, convince people that are now living under the Russians in Donbass and in Zaporozhye and these other places that, you're definitely being oppressed, which at the end of the day, if you're Orthodox, we know that's definitely not true. So the situation in Ukraine, with the church, obviously, we're going to keep covering it. I've said for years that I think that the schismatics and their relations with the uniates there is going to be a huge vector for this false union.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be used to, to muddy the waters and convince people that, we're already doing things the same way and we can maybe have a little petri dish here of what things could look like. And it's going to be very, very bad, especially for the people of Ukraine themselves. But if you have any thoughts on that or any of the other fronts in World War III ongoing GSP, I would love to hear them.
Sure. I've always wondered about like a split in the Orthodox world. Obviously, Ukraine is just the first piece of the puzzle that the Americans want. Of course, the Metropolitan of Constantinople has been instrumental in that. It would make sense, right? On a cultural level, other Orthodox in Europe would be maligned for being with the Orthodox Church of Russia. And ultimately, this is what they want, right? Because Russia would be the most resistant to this, right? So,
and you mentioned other Orthodox Christians in Europe. I mean, just a story I've heard from a friend in the Czech Republic. I mean, there's a Moscow Patriarchate Cathedral in some resort town somewhere in Czechia, and the government's trying to ban it overtly. We know that Czechoslovakia has their own autocephalous Orthodox Church, but there's Russians there as well, and like France has Russian Orthodox churches. Lots of Orthodox countries also have, Russian churches for Russian diaspora, and they're trying to ban that church entirely in some of these, in the Czech Republic, in these places. So this is
ultimately what they would want is countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia would take much longer, but Bulgaria and Romania, they would love those churches to hop on board with the direction, and especially the Greeks. The Greeks would be the easiest to convert to this idea.
And thankfully, with the Bulgarians, we got Patriarch Daniel, who I'm convinced we will not be fallen for that. And I don't know. I don't think the North Macedonians would either. GSP, maybe you have. I don't know how saintly y'all's archbishop is, but he seems a decent enough fellow.
I don't think so either. I mean, I'll say this about Macedonia, that, they are a country that had a NATO base, ever since, like, I mean, I remember going there after decades in, what year was it? It would have been 1997. And the taxi took me past this. And I said, "What's that?" And they said, "That's an American Air Force base." And I just thought, "Oh, crap." So, but Russia still had tremendous amount of influence there for the next 20 years at least, before North Macedonia or Macedonia became part of NATO. Again, what they'll do is they'll dangle the EU membership as a way of, betraying Russia. All to say, like, Macedonia withstood the pressure of the West better than Montenegro did, better than, like, really, in former Yugoslavia, it withstood that influence, for being such a small, weak nation, better than many of the other former provinces or oblasts of Yugoslavia. Um, so, yeah, I mean, I'm talking long range, right? Like, Ukraine is just the first piece in this. We don't know where we will be in 10 years, right? Um, if the West doesn't get what it wants in Russia, then the pressure on these other Orthodox countries to shun Russia, to create another kind of orthodoxy, they'll go for it. Again, I'm talking about 10, 15 years from now. Maybe it'll be sooner, maybe it'll be further away, but that's kind of that's what I'm thinking about privately. I don't often talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's the battle in the church. It's the forces of evil that seek to direct, the institutions of men that the institutions within the church that are guided by fallible men, that to guide them into perdition, into this geopolitics, versus the new crew of the ship coming in that St. Porphyrios prophesied, which I believe the new patriarch of Serbia is part of that, with how quickly he facilitated the resolution with the Macedonians. I believe the new patriarch of Bulgaria is part of that, with how stalwart and saintly he is. I believe we're going to see an end to the situation in Cyprus sooner rather than later. I believe in Russia we're seeing this new crew. In America we're seeing this new crew, and in other places we are as well. So in that regard, I'm also hopeful. So there's a bit of a hopeful end here to this more blackpilling episode, of course. But I want to make sure everybody checks out this huge article this week from Dimitri, who of course is gone, but he put out before he left part 2 of our Ritual Regicide series. This one is over 50,000 words, and I had to edit it, so be sure to check that out because it is a lot, and it is a lot of really interesting information. So get behind the paywall to get the full version of that. We would really like to hear your feedback. Obviously, that is going to be linked down below. It is, the further extensive analysis of the ritual regicide of the Romanovs, how they were killed by, Jewish, Kabbalistic, Talmudic forces in what was undoubtedly a satanic ritual. And the evidence for this is it goes so deep, and there is so much symbolism, and there is so much interconnecting threads between so much stuff that we talk about here on the show that you really just can't miss it. So be sure to check that out. Just get behind the paywall. It'll really support the show and help us out. But also be sure to follow us on the socials, World War Now _ on X. Be sure to subscribe to us, worldwarnow.co. That is the Substack. That's where you can support us everywhere. That's where the home base is. We're going to have another Q&A thread coming out here real soon. So if you're a supporter, get ready to ask me and Dimitri some questions. It's going to be good. So worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now. Please, please, please leave a comment. Wherever you are listening, like it, leave a comment. Stop what you're doing right now. Press that like button. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. Get us the World War Now Discord. More stuff keeps happening. I'm going to forget how to do the plugs because so much new stuff is coming. The World War Now Discord server is now up, so be sure to check that out. It is linked all over the place. So find that as well. We're having some great conversations on there. Some great World War Now guests are in there as well. So be sure to get in there to talk to them. And it's a great time, obviously. And anywhere else, follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Follow, again, the World War Now Twitter at World War Now _. Follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. That is the 24/7 news feed where we are constantly putting things out there that are going on in the Third World War. Again, we're going to have all of Isaac's stuff. We're going to have GSP's stuff, the link to the Constantine Martelli YouTube channel where he hosts the War Report. That is going to be down below. But with all of that, thank you so much for listening, everybody. GSP, I'll leave you with some last words. What do you have to say?
Well, thank you for having me on the show again. I know this is very black pilling. We're going to see even more struggles coming down the pike, and we need to pray, and especially for the Palestinians and the Syrians at this point, and also for all Orthodox, and especially Russia. So again, thank you very much for having me on. It was delightful. It was very nice. I always love doing shows with you guys. I appreciate it.
No, we appreciate having you on, GSP. Again, you as the group chat we have, it's the World War Now bench. So when somebody's out, we tap you guys in, and it's always a great show. So yeah, please let us know in the comments what you thought about all of our analysis. Give us your takes, what you think is going to happen in Syria. Unfortunately, I think GSP is right. No good news, definitely for the rest of the year, if not the early parts of 2025 coming out of that part of the world. But again, things could surprise us. Alexander Dugin and other people have said that this is a bit of a trap for Turkey. As again, if I didn't believe in the prophecies, I wouldn't believe that at all. But I do believe that this will lead to the deteriorating of relationships between Russia and Turkey to the point where Russia will surprise attack and win. And, people are making fun of Dugin's analysis, but I personally spoke to him about these prophecies, and I know that he understands their significance. So keep that in mind when you're reading all of this kind of stuff. And with all of that, thank you again so much for listening. worldwarnow.co. Subscribe if you haven't already. Again, you guys are the ones that make all of this possible. And keep praying for Palestine and Syria. Pray for all Orthodox Christians. And God bless. We will see you on the other side.
Thank you.